Hello again, and welcome to ChessLecture.com. My name is Dana McKenzie. Today I'm going to talk about forks, which are one of the most basic tactical motifs in chess. And this is in response to a request from some of our listeners for a little bit more basic material. So actually I'm going to have a series of lectures about tactical motifs. The first couple are going to be about forks, and then I'll talk about discovered attacks, X-ray attacks, pins, and so forth. So today we're going to talk about forks, and we'll also talk about them in my next lecture. So first of all, what is a fork? A fork is simply a move or an occasion in chess when one piece is attacking two different pieces at the same time. They have to be credible threats. So if your piece isn't really threatening to take those pieces, then it's not really a fork, or at least not an effective one. So I'm going to just start out by showing you a few examples. In this lecture, I'm going to do examples from openings. There are a lot of openings that have some forks in them. A lot of these tend to be opening traps, which is also something that I believe some readers have expressed interest in. But I don't think you should concentrate too much on memorizing these opening moves. I think you should really concentrate on understanding the principle of a fork and how forks come about, because you can't always expect your opponent just to walk into a fork, especially if it's a fairly good opponent. You'll somehow have to set it up a little bit. The first opening I'm going to examine is one that occurs extremely often in beginner to novice level chess. I'm sure that probably almost all of you have seen this opening on some occasions. And what's interesting is that I see this in the chess club I run for kids all the time, and for the most part the players are absolutely oblivious to a very important fork possibility in the position. So here's how it goes. Okay, so white begins with e4, black begins with e5, white goes knight f3, black goes knight c6, white goes knight c3, black goes knight f6. So far, very standard opening variation called the four knights opening. And then in beginner games, you'll very often see white continue bishop to c4, which looks like a perfectly good move. And then in beginner games, black will usually copy him and go bishop to c5, and then maybe white will play pawn to queen d3, black will play d6, and we get this sort of really kind of boring chess position where both sides are just kind of copying each other. And I think although this is easy for beginners to play, and it does teach you how to get your pieces out, it's unfortunate that beginners so often end up in this variation because it's somewhat boring. It's not the most exciting kind of style of chess. But if we go back to this position, there's actually already a very important tactical trick that most beginners, novice players don't know about, and it enables black to equalize the position extremely easily. Instead of playing bishop to c5, what black should do is play knight takes e4. Now this looks really surprising because black's giving away a piece. After all, white can just take the knight back, can't he? Well, if you haven't seen this before, take a look at the position and see what black's follow-up is that will win back the piece. Do you see it? The move is d5. Okay, so this advance of the pawn attacks both the bishop and the knight, so that makes it a fork. A fork is when you attack two pieces at once with the same piece. And what makes a fork so effective is that if your opponent moves one of the pieces to get it out of the attack, then you'll just take the other. And so if white moves the bishop, then black will take the knight. If white moves the knight, black will take the bishop. And in either way, either case, he wins his piece back and ends up with even material. So usually in this position, people will prefer to keep their bishop, so they'll play, say, bishop to d3, or maybe they'll play bishop to b5. I've played this a few times against kids in my kids' chess club. And then black just takes the knight, and white might take the pawn back. And now we have even material, but black has just a great game. Black can now do, say, queen to d5. Incidentally, here's another fork. Black is attacking both the knight and the bishop, and so white's got to move one of them. Fortunately, white does not actually lose material here, because he can, for example, play something like bishop takes knight check, thus getting his bishop out of attack. And then white's free to move his knight. But if you look at this position, white's game is just kind of, well, it's not so great. And black's game is beautiful. He's got two bishops. He's got a powerful centralized queen that can't be chased away easily. It's got very easy development. This is just a great game for black. So if you know about this little trick, it's a terrific thing to play in the opening. So once again, the whole idea behind it is this fork with the pawn on d5, and in fact, this variation actually is often called the fork trick, because what black has done is give away a piece temporarily in order to set up a fork that wins the piece back and wins it in a positionally very favorable way. So the fork trick is a very good thing to know, and if you're finding yourself in this position a lot in your games, then you'll be able to play it lots of times, and you'll have a very good record as black. Now, higher rated players, stronger players will not play bishop to c4, and so then you won't be able to play the fork trick anymore. But that's okay. At least we've learned a good general theme in the opening, this theme of the pawn advance that forks the bishop and the knight. Okay, let's now go to our second example. The second example I want to look at of a fork in the opening is also very instructive, although I think you'll very rarely have a chance to play it. But again, what we want to do is not so much concentrate on learning these memorizing the variations as understanding the idea of a fork. So this opening starts the same way, e4, e5, knight f3, and then black plays a very poor move, f6. This is actually called Damianos Defense, and this is such a bad move that you'll very seldom see anyone play it. Even beginners don't play this move. But why is it bad? Well, for starters, it doesn't develop a piece. It creates weaknesses in black's position, weakens the square, this diagonal from h5 to e8 that his king sits on. And it gets in the way of black's knight. So normally black would like to develop his knight to f6, but now he's got a pawn in the way. So about the only good thing you can say for the move f6 is that black is trying to defend his king pawn on e4. But he's not even doing that because, believe it or not, white can on the very next move play knight takes pawn. Okay, so this is again a little sacrifice that sets up a fork. If black recaptures, pawn takes knight, then white will play queen to h5 check. Remember I said that black, by playing his move f6, has weakened this diagonal from h5 to e8, and white's immediately taking advantage of it by giving a queen check. Now black has a couple moves here. Probably the better move is g6, but we see that the check wasn't just a check, it was a fork, because the white queen was attacking both the king and the pawn on e5. So so we had a fork here. Black defends the check, and then white is able to win the other piece. Not only that, he has another fork. Okay, so it's interesting how forks sometimes seem to proliferate. One fork leads to another. That's certainly the case here. So white is now attacking black's king, and he's also attacking the rook on h8. Black has to defend the first threat. He has to defend the check, say with a move like queen to e7, and then white snags the rook. And so white's basically a rook up and has a completely won game. So this is why nobody ever plays Damianos Defense, because white basically gets a won game on move 6 if he knows this little fork trick. Okay, for our third example of a fork in the opening, this one will be a little bit more complicated. And again, let's take a look at this one from black's point of view, because actually black is going to be doing all the nice forks in this position. So this opening is called the center game, and it starts the same way as the first two I showed you, with white playing e4 and black playing e5. And in the center game, white then follows up with the move d4. Now d4 is an interesting move because one of the things you want to do in the opening is establish a strong center, and one way to do that is by setting up this pawn duo on e4 and d4. So on the surface, this actually looks like a very good, principled opening move. But it actually has a poor reputation, and it's not played very often. The reason is that after black goes pawn takes pawn, and white goes queen takes pawn, which is the main line of the center game, the queen has basically come out a little bit too early. And most chess teachers will teach you not to bring the queen out too early. And so this is kind of a classic example of what you're not supposed to do in the opening as white. Now, having said that, though, actually, the center game is probably not as bad as its reputation. And it's a little bit tricky for black to find the right lines to play against it. Now, before we go on, let me point out one other thing in this position. Because it's a confusion I've sometimes had with some of my beginning students. They'll look at this move, the queen on d4, and they'll say, this is a fork. This is a really good fork because I'm attacking three things at once. The queen is threatening the pawn on a7. It's also threatening black's pawn on d7, and it's also threatening black's pawn on g7. So this looks like a terrific move, right? Three-way fork? Well, wrong. Remember I said in the beginning that to really qualify as a fork, you need to be making credible threats. And none of those three threats are credible. If white takes any of those three pawns next move, he'll just lose his queen. If he goes queen takes pawn on a7, then black will go rook takes queen. So these are not credible threats, and white's not really creating a fork here, which means black doesn't have to worry about defending any of them, and instead the best move for black is simply to play knight to c6. And this is a good move. It develops a piece, and it also attacks white's queen, forcing the queen to move again. So this is why, as I said, the center game doesn't have a good reputation, because black is developing his pieces while white is getting his queen chased around. But let's look a little bit farther at this opening and see what comes next. Okay, so white's played queen to e3, which is one of the book moves, not the only move, but it's a good possibility. Now, the book move for black in this position, I think is kind of hard to find. I mean, it's a natural move, but it looks a little bit dangerous. The correct move for black here is knight to f6. Now, the reason that I think that this is a little bit hard to find is that it seems to invite the response e5. And if you have a really hyper-aggressive player of the white pieces, they'll probably play e5, which looks like a pretty good move because it's attacking that knight that's come out just on the last move. So what's black going to do about this? Well, the answer is black plays knight to g4, which, in keeping with the theme of our lecture, it sets up a fork. Black is actually threatening four of white's pieces, but he's got two credible threats. One of them is threatening knight takes queen. That's very credible. White has got to do something about that. And there's also a threat of playing knight takes pawn. Not the pawn on e5, not the pawns on h2 or f2. Those are well defended, but black is attacking the e5 pawn twice, and so he's threatening to win it. So this is already a fork, but this isn't the last fork. Remember how I said forks sometimes have a way of proliferating, and that happens in this variation as well. Okay, so white, a good move for white here is queen to e4. Now here white's idea is that if black actually takes the pawn, he's going to attack the knight with f4. And the knight is pinned. It's not able to move because that would put black into check. Now, pins are a subject we'll probably take up in a later lecture, but basically in this situation, black has to lose a piece. Now, believe it or not, actually black gets a great deal of counterplay he actually can sacrifice this piece, and the computer thinks that black's position is okay. But for a lot of players, this might not be quite to their taste. You might be a little bit worried about sacrificing material so early. So there is a better, or not better, but an equally good line for black, and this is how the book line goes. Okay, now it seems like black's got a problem. White's attacking his knight, and where's the knight going to go? We said that taking the pawn walks into a pin, can't go back to f6, don't want to go back to h6 because then the bishop would take you. Bishop on c1 would take, if you played knight to h6, white could play bishop takes knight and really mess up black's pawn formation. So black doesn't want to do that. So what's black going to do about this knight? This is why, as I said, it's a little bit of a tricky variation, and unless black actually knows this line, he might not find the right move. Okay, so the book move in this position is d5. Now this is a great move. It does two things at once, and one thing I want to emphasize in this lecture and my later lectures as well is that it's a terrific thing in chess when you can do two things at once. That's really how you get ahead in chess, and I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of the lecture. So what this move d5 does is, first of all, it opens up the line for the bishop on c8 to defend the knight on g4. So now white can't play queen takes knight because black would take the queen and be winning. So black defended his knight, and secondly, at the same time, he's attacking white's queen with his pawn on d5. So this move is a 2-for-1 move. You get two things for one. You're defending the knight, you're attacking the queen. Now, there's one obvious problem with this move, which is white can take the pawn en passant. Pawn takes pawn check. So this is actually another kind of 2-for-1 move that I'll talk about in a later lecture, a discovered check. The reason it's 2-for-1 is that white's attacking the king, and he also just won a pawn on d6, so he gets 2 for the price of 1. So you might say, well, this isn't looking too good for black, but let's keep on going and look a little bit deeper. So black's only really good response is bishop to e6. And now, as we said, white has won a pawn, but the only way for him to hang on to that pawn, to stay a pawn ahead, would be to go pawn takes pawn. So what if white does that? Pawn takes pawn. Now actually white's 2 pawns ahead. So things are getting worse for black, right? Wrong. Things are, just when things look the worst is when they're their best. Okay, the correct move for black here, an amazing move, is queen to d1 check. It looks like a misprint or a mistake. My God, black is just giving away his queen. White goes king takes queen, but now here's the point. Knight takes pawn check. Okay, and a huge fork. It forks the king on d1 and the queen on e4. So it attacks 2 pieces. Actually, it attacks 3 pieces at once. It attacks the rook as well on h1. So a fork like this is sometimes called a family fork when you're attacking, basically the whole kit and caboodle of white's pieces. So what an incredible move! What a beautiful position for black. And so of course white has to get out of check. He plays king to e1, and black goes knight takes queen. And now let's stop to assess the position. Okay, so first of all, black has won one of his pawns back. So black is now only 1 pawn down, and that extra pawn for white is this pawn on c7, which is going to be very hard to defend. So in the long run, white cannot hang on to that pawn. So black is certain to win the second pawn back. And so basically black is going to be even in material. So we've seen that once again, the fork trick enables black to temporarily sacrifice material but win it back. Not only that, okay, not only is black going to be even in material, but he's got way better development. He's got 3 pieces developed to none for white. So this kind of superiority in development is actually already worth probably close to a pawn in its own right. So even if black couldn't win back a pawn right away, he'd still probably have a pawn's worth of compensation. So this is a great position for black. It has nothing to be afraid of. And so if black knows this line, then he's got nothing to fear in this whole variation. And so that's one reason why perhaps the center game is not considered to be so great for white. But, it's a tricky line. So just to review, the whole idea was where white went wrong here was being too aggressive too soon. In the opening, you want to bring out your pieces, but what's white doing? He's bringing out his queen, and he's pushing his pawn. All he's done is move those two pieces. He hasn't brought out any of his knights or bishops, while black has. And so it's natural that black should be able to find a good response to this. Chess principles really say that black should be able to find a good response and that white's premature attack shouldn't work. But very often, general principles go only so far, and then it comes down to concrete tactics. And that's where you've got to know your tactical motifs. And in particular in this position, the tactical motif of the fork. All right, let's do one more example of a fork in the opening. So far, all the examples I've shown you are from king pawn openings. In fact, from double king pawn openings with e4 and e5. So just for the sake of variety, I'd like to show you a fork trap that occurs in a d pawn opening. And again, we'll look at it from the black point of view. Okay, so the opening we're going to look at is called the King's Indian Defense. Okay, so d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop to g7. Now, if you're a beginner, you may not have seen this opening before. It's a little bit different strategy for black. Instead of putting his pawns in the center, as we saw in the other variations, in the King's Indian Defense, black is trying to attack the center from the wings. So this type of opening is called hypermodern because in the 1920s, when it first came about, this was considered a very radical, strange idea for black. Now it's completely normal. You'll see this opening in just oodles and oodles of master games. So if you're seeing this for the first time, this is going to be kind of a good illustration of the ideas behind it. And the game we're going to be looking at is a game that actually was played in 1925. So this is when the King's Indian was first coming about and first really becoming accepted as a reasonable opening for black. And it's between a guy named Norman as white, that's his last name, and Vidmar, who is a famous Czech master, as black. So, of course, the famous guy always wins in these examples. So black is going to win this game. What's interesting is that actually the same opening, the exact same moves have been played many times since then. So it's a trap that even a lot of masters have fallen into, not just beginners. Okay, so let's continue with knight to f3, castles, e4. So white's built up a very big, strong center, strong-looking center, I should emphasize. So this is why people originally didn't think this opening could be good for black, because white has such a big center. But we'll see. Black actually has good counterattacking resources. So black plays d6. Now white, this guy Norman, played bishop to d3. This move is seldom played anymore. It's not really considered to be the correct way of developing white's king bishop. And we'll see why in this game. We'll see exactly why. Nowadays, white players will usually play their bishop to e2 instead. Okay, so Vidmar plays bishop to g4, developing a bishop, pinning the knight on f3. And white plays h3, a reasonable looking move, attacking the bishop right away. And so black has to decide whether to move it back or take the knight. He decides to take the knight. White goes, queen takes bishop. And black brings his knight out to c6. Now we can start understanding black's strategy in this opening. So white's problem is he's got so many pawns in the center that he can't keep them all defended. So he's got his pawn on e4 defended nicely, but that pawn on d4 is not defended at all. And so black is going to start putting pressure on it. Okay, now white has one easy way of defending it, which is to go bishop to e3. And now black does an interesting move, knight to d7. Now what this does is it discovers an attack on the d pawn. So discovered attacks are something we'll talk about in a later lecture, but what he's done is by moving his knight out of the way, he now makes his bishop on g7 attack the pawn on d4. So black is now threatening the d pawn because he's got two attackers and the pawn has only one defender. Now in this position, the only really good move playable move for white is to play, whoops, not that. The only playable move for white actually here is d5. But this is really not a pleasant move at all for white because black would just jump in with his knight to e5, putting his knight on a beautiful square and probably winning the bishop on d3. And after that, his other knight can jump in either to e5 or c5, and black will just have a very, very pleasant game. So white didn't want to allow that, and so instead he played what looks like a good, solid defensive move, knight to e2. So what could be wrong with that? Okay, well, remember, this lecture is about forks, so I want you to look for a fork in this position. Okay, do you see the idea? Black plays knight to e5. Now, once again, this may shock you, because black is putting his knight where white can take it. So pawn takes knight. Good God, we're a piece down. Okay, it looks bad for black. Black has just given away a piece for nothing, right? Well, wrong. Okay, so black goes knight takes pawn. And, I think this is actually kind of humorous because white thought he was defending the threat, chopping off the head of black's position, and then, whoops, the head grew back again. So we still have the same knight, a different knight attacking the same two pieces. So the knight threatens the queen, it threatens the bishop, and this time white has no way out. The knight's attacking the queen on f3, attacking the bishop on d3. White has to save his queen, and so then black wins the bishop with knight takes bishop check. And not only that, he's got yet another fork. He's attacking the king on e1 and also the pawn on b2. So I talked before about how forks tend to propagate, and this is certainly a good example. So at this point, black's already a pawn up. He's going to win another pawn, and so this is just a completely winning game for black. Okay, so that's the last example of a fork in the opening that I want to go over. So let's review some of the ideas that we've seen in this lecture. Okay, so again, the basic idea of a fork is one piece attacking two. Now, one thing you might have noticed in these examples is that in none of the examples did the one player just walk into the fork, just let the other guy play it. Instead, there was always something that had to be done to set up the fork. Okay, so for example, in this case, the setup was this knight sacrifice, which basically then allowed the other knight in. And in each of the other examples, we also saw a sacrifice that, for example, the one we saw with the center game where we did the queen sacrifice, and that moved white's king over so that it was in a forkable position. So often you'll sacrifice a piece either to clear the square for your forking piece or to move one of your opponent's pieces into the right position to fork it. So it's important to understand that the fork won't happen by itself. You sometimes have to set it up. Of course, occasionally your opponent will walk into a fork, and let me just show you an example like that I had in a game of my own fairly recently, and this is a really easy example to end the lecture with. Okay, so this is a game I played last year against an expert, and this will show that experts can actually fall into, just simply walk into forks. So we'll start with e4, e6. This is called the French defense. Knight f3, d5, knight c3. Now I'm white, and my opponent Bob Hollyman is black. This is not the most common opening for white, but let's not worry about that. It actually transposes to a main line soon enough. Black goes pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight to d7, d4, bishop e7, bishop d3, and knight f6. Okay, we're now in a standard French variation called the Byrne variation. It's considered a little bit passive for black because his pieces are a little bit cramped. White's pieces are a little bit more active, but black has no weaknesses, which makes it an attractive opening in some ways. So let's carry on with the game. I played c3, basically preparing a place for my bishop to back up to if necessary, also defending my d-pawn. He played c5. I played knight takes pawn. He played knight takes knight, which actually turns out was not the best move. The book move here is actually bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, knight takes pawn, and the reason it's the book move is that now white has to retreat his bishop, say to e2, and now that allows a trade of queens with a very simplified drawish sort of position. That's certainly nothing for black to worry about. So I didn't really know that, and maybe my opponent didn't either. I don't know, because he took with the knight. I did pawn takes. He played bishop takes. I castled, and he castled. So pretty normal position at this point. Both sides just getting their pieces out. I played queen to e2. And he played b6. Now, this is an interesting point. He's trying to develop his queen bishop, the bishop on c8, which is one of the liabilities of the French defense. That bishop is currently blocked by his pawn at e6, and so he's trying to get it to a more aggressive position, like on b7, for example. Now, I played bishop to g5, developing my last piece, and setting up a pin on his knight, and he decided to break the pin with bishop to e7. This was a terrible mistake. So now I want you to look at the position and see what was so bad about that move. And again, the answer has to do with the fork. Okay, do you see it? It's just a very simple little trick. It doesn't even involve any sacrifices this time. I just played bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and queen to e4. This is a fork because it's attacking the pawn on h7, which would be checkmate, so it's a very serious threat. And it's also attacking the rook on a1. And so black has to defend the checkmate, say with a move like g6. In fact, that's about the only way to defend. And then white takes the rook and fights a piece up. In fact, so black actually resigned instead of continuing in that position. So here we see a very simple-minded fork, which shows that that your opponents can sometimes just walk into forks. The only setup required here was that in this position I had to visualize the fork with queen to e4, and I had to realize that his knight was stopping it. So all I needed to do was remove the knight, and then I could play the fork with queen to e4. Now, why did my opponent miss this? There's an interesting psychological reason, I think, which is that it's a long-range fork. It's forking two things that are very far apart, the pawn on h7 and the rook on a8. And I think that typically it's very hard to spot long-range forks. So that's something you might want to look at, and if you can ever set up a long-range fork, it's more likely that your opponent will overlook it than a simple pawn fork. Okay, so that's our last example, and so I hope you've enjoyed some of these examples of forks in the opening. In my next lecture, I'm going to talk about forks in the middle game and ending. For ChessLecture.com, this is Dana McKenzie.